After 50 years of marriage, my husband demanded a divorce on our golden anniversary. "You'll get nothing. All the property is mine." But I just smiled and said 3 words that made him turn pale. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Ellis, and I have lived long enough to know that the cruelest wounds don't come from strangers. They come from the person who knows exactly where to press. Harold and I met in the autumn of 1973 at a church social in a small town in Ohio. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, with a laugh that filled up a room. I was 29, a schoolteacher with ink-stained fingers, and a weakness for a man who could quote Steinbeck. We married the following spring. By the time our golden anniversary arrived, I had taught elementary school for 26 years, raised 3 children in a house we'd bought together on Maple Drive, and cooked somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000 meals. I don't say that to complain. I say it because it matters. Every dish, every parent-teacher conference, every mortgage payment signed with both our names. It all matters. For most of those 50 years, the marriage was what I would call decent, not perfect. Harold was not a demonstrative man. He didn't bring flowers or say, "I love you" easily. But he was present, he was steady, and I had made my peace with what he was. We had our rhythms. Morning coffee on the back porch, Sunday drives through the countryside, the quiet companionship of 2 people who have learned each other's silences. I thought that was enough. I thought we had built something permanent. The first cracks appeared about 3 years before everything fell apart. Small things. The kind you explain away because the alternative is too large to look at directly. Harold began taking longer business trips, though he had been semi-retired for 2 years. He started keeping his phone face down on the kitchen table. He grew impatient with me in a way that was new. Sharp little corrections about the way I loaded the dishwasher, the way I spoke at dinner parties, the way I dressed. Once he told me I was embarrassing at a neighbor's cookout. I had made a joke about getting old. Everyone laughed. He did not. Then there was the matter of the finances. Harold had always handled the money. In our generation, that was not unusual. I trusted him, but when our youngest, Daniel, mentioned offhandedly that he'd seen Dad talking to a lawyer outside the county courthouse, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. When I asked Harold about it, he said he'd been helping a friend with a real estate matter. I told myself that was reasonable. I told myself a lot of things. Our daughter Susan noticed something too. She called me one Thursday evening, her voice careful in a way that meant she was choosing her words. "Mom," she said, "has Dad seemed strange to you lately? Different?" I said I didn't know what she meant. She paused. "He had lunch with Cheryl Patterson last week. Twice." Cheryl Patterson was a widow from our church, 63 years old, dyed red hair, a habit of touching men's arms when she talked to them. I had never thought much about her. I began to think about her a great deal after that. I want to be honest about something. I did not confront Harold directly. Not then. I was afraid of what he might say. I was 79 years old, and I was afraid of my own husband. Isn't that a terrible thing to admit? After 50 years, I still could not bear the thought of hearing it out loud. So I watched, and I waited, and I noticed more. The new cologne on his collar. The occasional evening when he came home later than expected. The way he sometimes looked at me across the dinner table with an expression I couldn't quite name. It was not hatred. It was something more dismissive than that. It was the look of a man who has already decided something and is simply waiting for the right moment to announce it. That moment came on our golden anniversary. We had invited 42 people to a dinner at Rosewood Manor, the event hall on the edge of town. Our children were there, our grandchildren, old friends, neighbors. The tables were set with white roses, my choice, and there was a cake with 50 gold candles. I wore the blue dress I'd bought 3 weeks before, the one that Susan said made me look like a proper queen. I felt happy that evening. I genuinely felt happy. Harold waited until after dinner, when the speeches were finished and people were beginning to drift toward the dance floor. He touched my elbow and guided me through the side door onto the terrace, away from the lights and the music. The night air was cool. I thought perhaps he was going to tell me something tender. I actually thought that. Instead, he straightened up, clasped his hands in front of him, and said, "Margaret, I've been to see Robert Finch." Robert Finch was a divorce attorney. Everyone in the county knew that. I want a divorce. I've already started the paperwork. He paused. And just so you know, I've structured everything carefully. The house, the accounts, the investments. You're not going to get a thing. It's all mine. He looked at me as though he expected me to collapse, as though 50 years of my life could be folded up and handed back to me in a blank envelope on a terrace while 40 people danced inside. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I smiled, and I said 3 quiet words that made all the color drain out of his face. "I know everything." He stared at me. I held his gaze long enough to let the words do their work, and then I turned around and walked back inside. I smiled at the guests. I danced one slow song with my grandson, Tyler, who was 9 years old, and stepped on my feet twice. I ate a piece of anniversary cake. And when Harold came back through the door 20 minutes later, pale as chalk and unable to look at me directly, I simply poured myself another glass of sparkling water and asked our neighbor Patricia whether her hydrangeas had come back this year. I drove myself home that night. Harold rode with our son Michael, claiming he'd had too much to drink. I suspect the truth was simpler. He didn't know what to say to me in an enclosed space. Once home, I sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning. No lights, just the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of the neighborhood settling. And I thought clearly, perhaps more clearly than I had thought in years, about exactly what my situation was. The house on Maple Drive was worth, by my rough estimate, somewhere between $320,000 and $350,000. We had purchased it in 1981 for $68,000, and I had contributed every cent of my teacher's salary toward the mortgage for 26 years. The deed, however, was in Harold's name alone. He had insisted on that arrangement in 1981, and I had been young enough and trusting enough not to question it. That was the first stone of the wall he had been building. Our savings accounts, 2 of them, one joint, one in Harold's name only, held approximately $200,000 combined. I had access to the joint account, but I had no way of knowing, sitting in the dark that night, how much Harold had already moved, shifted, or hidden. He had mentioned investments. I didn't know the full scope of those. There was also the matter of his pension from the manufacturing company, where he had worked for 31 years, and a small portfolio of stocks that he had always managed without my involvement. I had never asked enough questions. I had trusted. And now I was 79 years old, sitting in an unlit kitchen, trying to calculate the cost of that trust. I want to tell you honestly what I felt in those hours. There was grief, yes. A heavy, settled grief for the life I had believed I was living. There was humiliation. There was fear, the cold and practical kind. What does a woman my age do without the home she has lived in for 43 years? But underneath all of it, there was something else beginning to burn. Something quiet and very focused. I recognized it because I had felt it once before, in 1987, when the school board tried to eliminate my position, and I spent 3 months building a case that made them reverse the decision. I had felt it when someone underestimated me. Harold had underestimated me. By the time dawn came, I had made several decisions. The first was that I would not discuss the situation with Harold again until I had spoken to an attorney. Not Robert Finch, his attorney, but one of my own. The second was that I needed to know exactly what assets existed before any legal proceedings began, because Harold had clearly been preparing this for some time, and every day I waited was another day he had to move things out of reach. The third decision was the most important. I would not let anyone see that I was frightened. Not Harold, not his attorney, not his whatever she was to him, Cheryl Patterson, not anyone. I thought about those 3 words I had said to him on the terrace. I know everything. The truth was, I knew much less than I had implied, but he didn't know that. And the uncertainty I had planted in him, that small seed of panic, was the only advantage I currently had. I intended to use the time it bought me. On Monday morning, I called my friend Doris Kaminsky. Doris had been through a divorce of her own 12 years before and had come out the other side with her house, her dignity, and a sharp opinion about family law. "You need Patricia Holloway," she said, without hesitation. "She's in Columbus. She doesn't lose." I wrote the name down. Then I called my youngest, Daniel, not to tell him everything, not yet, but to ask, casually, whether he knew anything more about Harold's meetings with lawyers. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, carefully, "Mom, he met with Finch 3 times in the last 2 months, and last week he changed the beneficiary on his life insurance." I thanked Daniel, told him I was fine, and hung up. Then I sat very still for a moment. He had changed the beneficiary on his life insurance, not a small administrative oversight, a deliberate act. I thought of the cologne on his collar. I thought of Cheryl Patterson touching men's arms. I picked up the phone and made an appointment with Patricia Holloway for the following Thursday. The plan had begun. I drove to Columbus on a Thursday morning in early October through a landscape of turning maples and pale gray sky. I wore a good coat, the charcoal wool one I'd kept since my last year of teaching, and I brought with me a manila folder containing everything I had been able to gather in the preceding days: copies of our mortgage documents from 1981, the deed to the house, which, as I had feared, bore only Harold's name, our most recent joint bank statement, and a handwritten timeline I had constructed from memory of every financial decision I could recall from the past 3 years. Patricia Holloway's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, spare and orderly, with 2 diplomas on the wall and a window overlooking a courtyard. She was in her mid-50s, with close-cropped silver hair and a manner that was direct without being unkind. She read through my documents without speaking. When she finished, she set them down and looked at me. "Mrs. Ellis," she said, "how long have you been a teacher?" 26 years, I said. "Why?" "Because you've organized this better than most clients who come to me with 5 years' warning." She paused. "Now, tell me about the deed." We talked for 2 hours. Patricia explained what I had already begun to suspect: that Ohio is an equitable distribution state, which means marital assets are divided fairly. Not necessarily equally, but based on contribution. My decades of financial contribution to the household, the mortgage payments made from my salary, the documented labor of running a home while Harold built his career, all of it was relevant. The deed being in his name alone was a complication, not a death sentence. It could be contested, but Patricia was also honest with me. "He's had time to prepare," she said. "The question is how much he's moved already, and where." She recommended we file immediately for a financial disclosure order, which would legally require Harold to produce a complete accounting of all marital assets. "The moment he knows you have an attorney," she said, "he'll understand that your 3 words on that terrace weren't a bluff." I authorized her to proceed. Back home, things began to shift. I noticed it first on a Sunday afternoon. when Harold came downstairs to find me reading at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. Perfectly ordinary, except that I had placed my new attorney's business card deliberately visible next to my cup. Harold's eyes went to it. He said nothing. But that evening, he was on the phone for a long time in the back bedroom with the door closed. 2 days later, Michael called me. He sounded strained. "Mom, Dad told me you've hired a lawyer. He's upset. He says you're making this into a battle when it doesn't need to be." I asked Michael what he thought it needed to be. He was quiet. "I don't know," he said finally. "I just don't want you both to get hurt." I told him I appreciated that, and that I would be in touch. I understood what was happening. Harold was working the family, trying to position me as the aggressor, the one who had escalated. It was a familiar tactic from someone who had been planning this while I was still trusting him. He wanted our children to gently pressure me toward a quiet, uncontested settlement, one structured, as he had promised on the terrace, to leave me with nothing. Then came the evidence. Daniel had been cautious about getting involved, but he was my son, and he was angry. One evening, he stopped by while Harold was at a church committee meeting. He sat across from me at the very same kitchen table where I had sat alone in the dark, and he slid a piece of paper toward me. It was a photograph, a screenshot, technically, taken from a public social media profile. In it, Harold and Cheryl Patterson sat together at a restaurant I recognized. Aurelio's, on 5th Street, upscale, the kind of place Harold had told me was too expensive when I'd once suggested it for our anniversary dinner. The photo had been posted 8 months ago. Cheryl was looking at Harold across a candle-lit table. His hand was visible on the tablecloth, close to hers. The caption read, "Wonderful evening with a wonderful friend." Daniel also placed a second document on the table. It was a bank statement. Not ours, but one he had come across by accident when Harold, uncharacteristically careless, had left it on the counter in the garage. It showed a savings account in Harold's name only, at a different bank from either of our known accounts. The balance was $47,000, a hidden account. $47,000 I had never known existed. I looked at both documents for a long moment. Then I picked up my phone and sent Patricia Holloway a message. "I have something for you. Can you see me tomorrow?" The point of no return was behind me now. I could feel it, like stepping off a curb you hadn't noticed until you were already in the street. There was no quiet settlement in my future. There was only forward. Patricia Holloway received the bank statement and the photograph with the focus of someone who had seen worse and knew exactly what to do with better. She examined the hidden account documentation first. "This establishes financial concealment," she said. "It strengthens our case considerably for equitable distribution." She held up the photograph next, studied it briefly, and set it aside. "This one matters less to the division of assets, but it establishes context, and juries notice context even in civil matters." She looked at me. "Mrs. Ellis, I'm going to file the disclosure motion today, and I'd like to request an injunction to freeze the known accounts pending proceedings. Are you prepared for him to know immediately?" "Yes," I said. There was nothing hesitant in my voice. I surprised myself a little. The injunction was filed that afternoon. Harold received notification the following morning. I was in the garden when he came out of the house. He had the look of a man who has been informed of something he believed impossible. His face was tight, controlled, but his eyes were doing something else entirely. "You froze the accounts," he said. "My attorney froze the accounts," I said, "temporarily, pending disclosure." "Margaret." He stepped closer. His voice dropped to the register he used when he was very serious. "You need to stop this. Robert says if you keep pushing, this becomes a full public proceeding. Our name will be in the county records. The children will be pulled into it. Is that what you want?" "What I want," I said, "is a fair accounting of 50 years of shared assets. That seems reasonable to me." He stared at me. Then he went back inside. But Harold did not work alone. 2 days later, Cheryl Patterson came to my door. I want you to understand how that felt. To stand in the doorway of my own home and see that woman on my front step, her red hair perfectly styled, her expression arranged into something she intended to pass for concern. She asked if she could come in. I said no. "Margaret," she said, her voice soft, "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Harold loves you. He's just confused. Men our age go through these phases." "Cheryl," I said, "I know about the account at Midwest Savings. I know about Aurelio's in February, and I know about the beneficiary change on the life insurance. My attorney also knows. So I'd encourage you very sincerely to be careful about how you characterize this conversation later." Her expression changed. The concern dissolved. What was underneath it was less pleasant. "You're going to walk away with nothing," she said quietly. "Harold has been planning this for 2 years. You don't understand what you're dealing with." "I understand perfectly," I said, and I closed the door. That evening, I received a call from an unknown number. The voice was male, not Harold's. I didn't recognize it. He said only that I should think carefully about making public accusations, and that older women who make trouble in court can find things become very complicated. Then he hung up. I sat for a moment with the phone in my hand. Then I called Patricia and described the call in full detail. "Save the record of that number," she said, "and write down exactly what was said with the time. That may constitute witness intimidation." I wrote it down. I wrote everything down. The following week, Patricia appeared in court for the preliminary hearing on the disclosure motion. Robert Finch appeared for Harold. The judge, a composed woman in her 60s named Judge Anita Warren, reviewed the filing, noted the evidence of the concealed account, and granted the motion. Harold was ordered to produce a full financial disclosure within 30 days. I sat in that courtroom in my charcoal wool coat, and I felt the particular satisfaction of someone who has been told they have no power and has just watched a judge disagree. Harold and Cheryl went quiet after that. No more visits. No more calls from unknown numbers. Robert Finch sent a formal letter through Patricia's office, suggesting a mediated settlement. Patricia sent back a polite reply indicating we would review the disclosure documents before considering any settlement discussions. After all of it, the confrontation, the threat on the phone, the look on Cheryl Patterson's face, I allowed myself 3 quiet days. I drove out to my sister Ruth's lake house in Indiana, where there was nothing but the sound of water and the smell of leaves. I slept 10 hours the first night. I sat on the dock in the afternoons and didn't think about account numbers or injunctions or the expression on Harold's face when I closed the door. I thought about the kitchen table in 1987 and the school board, and how I had won that time too. I drove back from Ruth's lake house on a Sunday afternoon, through the flat Indiana countryside, going gold with October. I felt steadier, not unafraid. Fear was still present, like a low hum beneath everything, but I was no longer at risk of being governed by it. There is a difference between feeling afraid and allowing fear to make your decisions. I had learned that difference somewhere in my late 30s, and I was grateful for it now. The settlement offer arrived on Tuesday via Patricia's office. Harold and Robert Finch had clearly spent the quiet week crafting something that was designed to look reasonable to a tired woman who simply wanted it over. The document offered me $65,000 in a lump sum payment, the right to remain in the Maple Drive house for 12 months before it was sold, and a monthly support payment of $800 for 3 years. After that, nothing. I sat with Patricia in her Columbus office and read it carefully. Then I set it down. "They're offering me less than 20% of the joint account balance alone," I said, "and no equity in the house." "Correct," said Patricia. "And the 12-month residency clause has a termination provision. Any legal action on your part during that period voids the arrangement." That was the real mechanism. Sign this, stay quiet, make no claims. And in 12 months, I'd be out of the house with $65,000 and diminishing support payments. Refuse, and presumably they would argue I was being unreasonable. The offer was not generosity. It was a door designed to look like an exit but function as a cage. "No," I said. Patricia nodded as though she had expected nothing else. "I'll draft the response." What I did not expect in those quiet days before the next legal volley was how much the people around me would step forward. Susan, my eldest, who had always been more cautious than her brothers, more careful about taking sides, drove up from Cincinnati on a Wednesday and sat with me for 6 hours at the kitchen table. She did not preach or perform. She brought a casserole and a bottle of decent wine, and she listened to everything I told her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom, I've known something was wrong for over a year. I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." I told her there was nothing to apologize for. She squeezed my hand, and that was enough. Daniel had been my steadiest support from the beginning. He had found the hidden bank statement. He called every few days, not to ask about the case, but simply to check in. Had I eaten? Was I sleeping? Did I need him to drive me to Columbus? He was 44 years old, and he had his father's jaw and my stubbornness, and I was very glad of it. The new ally came from an unexpected direction. Her name was Vera Aldrich, and she was the wife of Harold's oldest friend, a man named George, who had been his fishing companion for 30 years. Vera called me on a Thursday evening, hesitantly, as if she wasn't sure she should. "Margaret," she said, "I don't want to interfere, but George has been troubled. Harold talked to him about some of this, the financial arrangements, the plans. George didn't know the full picture until recently." She paused. "George kept some of the text messages Harold sent him about accounts, about timing. He thought you should know they exist." I asked Vera if George would be willing to speak with Patricia Holloway. There was a pause. "He's already agreed," she said. I thanked her. After I hung up, I sat for a moment with my hands folded on the table and thought about what it means to spend a life among people. 50 years of church committees and neighborhood barbecues, and parent-teacher evenings and ordinary Saturdays. You think sometimes that the connections you've made are decorative, pleasant but peripheral. Then something like this happens, and you discover they are structural. They hold things up. Harold had built his plan in the assumption that I was alone. He had calculated my age, my dependency, my trust. And he had assumed those things added up to isolation. He was wrong. I was not alone at all. They came on a Saturday morning, the second week of November. I heard Harold's car in the driveway and looked out the kitchen window to see him walking up the front path, and Cheryl Patterson 2 steps behind him. The audacity of it was almost admirable, in the way that a very steep cliff is almost admirable. You can respect the scale of something without being willing to step off it. I opened the door before they could ring the bell. I wanted them to know I had seen them coming. "Margaret." Harold's voice was different from anything I'd heard from him in months. Softer, careful, engineered for the occasion. He was wearing the blue sweater our daughter Susan had given him for Christmas 3 years ago. A deliberate choice, I thought. Something familiar, something that carried history. "Can we come in? I think we need to talk." I looked at him, and then I looked at Cheryl, who had arranged her expression into something that may have been intended to convey humility. I stepped back and let them through. I wanted to hear exactly what they had planned to say. We sat in the living room. I chose the armchair across from the sofa, which put the coffee table between us. A small distance, but a real one. Cheryl sat close to Harold on the sofa. She did not offer to leave the two of us alone, and Harold did not suggest it. That told me something. Whatever this visit was meant to accomplish, it was a joint operation. They had rehearsed it, I suspected, in that apartment on Ridgeway Drive, over coffee, deciding together which notes to strike. Harold began. He said he had been doing a great deal of thinking. He said the lawyers had made everything adversarial when it didn't need to be. He said he had never wanted me to feel afraid or abandoned, and that perhaps he had handled the announcement poorly. He said the word love twice in 3 sentences. It was a capable performance. In a different life, in a different room, with a different history behind me, it might have moved me. But I had sat in a dark kitchen at 2 in the morning and calculated what he had built and what he had hidden and what he had planned. And I knew the difference between a man who loves you and a man who has decided your suffering would be more convenient if you cooperated with it. "Harold," I said, "what is it you'd like me to do?" He leaned forward. "Drop the disclosure motion. Let Robert and Patricia work out a quiet settlement. Something fair for both of us. No court dates, no public record, no depositions." He paused. "You're 79 years old, Margaret. This process is going to exhaust you. The stress alone—" "You're using my age as an argument," I said. "I'm using it as a concern. You've been planning this for 2 years," I said. "You opened a separate account. You changed your insurance beneficiary. You consulted an attorney 3 times before you said a word to me. And now you're asking me to trust a quiet settlement with the same man who did those things." There was a silence. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. Outside, a car passed on the street. The ordinary world continued without interest in what was happening in my living room. Cheryl spoke then, for the first time. Her voice had lost the softness it had carried on my doorstep weeks before. "Margaret, you need to think about what a court proceeding means at your age. The stress, the cost, the exposure. Harold is trying to make this easy for you." She looked at me steadily. "You should take the offer." "Should I?" I said. "You won't do better in court," she said. "Judges in this county know Harold. He has standing here. You're going to spend everything you have on legal fees and walk away with less than what's on the table." I noticed she said you should take the offer, not you deserve better, or we want what's fair. She said it the way someone says it when the offer benefits them, not you. I filed that away. I had been filing things away for 3 months, and my mental files were very full. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about Vera Aldrich's phone call. I thought about George's text messages, sitting in Patricia Holloway's files in Columbus. I thought about the judge's face when she'd granted the disclosure motion. "I'd like you both to leave now," I said. Harold's careful softness folded. "Margaret, I have nothing further to discuss outside of a legal proceeding," I said. "Please leave my home." They left. Harold went first, quickly, as if pace could substitute for dignity. Cheryl paused in the doorway and looked back at me with an expression that was not concern, not persuasion, not anything she had worn for the past 45 minutes. It was flat and cold and entirely unmasked, and she said, "You're making a mistake." I closed the door. I leaned against it for a moment in the hallway, alone. The house was very quiet. I could hear the furnace running in the basement, the creak of the floorboard near the coat closet. Sounds I had known for 43 years. This house knew me. It had absorbed the sounds of my children growing up, of dinners and arguments and ordinary Tuesdays, of every version of the woman I had been in this marriage. And now I was standing in its hallway, leaning against its door, and someone had just told me I was making a mistake by fighting to keep it. And I will tell you honestly, I was afraid. Not of losing the case, not of the legal process. I was afraid in some older, deeper place, afraid of the fact that the man I had made a life with was capable of standing in my living room and performing care while planning to leave me destitute. That kind of fear doesn't dissolve in courtrooms. It lives alongside you. But here is what I also know. Fear, when you don't run from it, becomes fuel. I straightened up, walked back to the kitchen, and called Patricia. They came to the house, I said. Both of them. Tell me everything, she said. I did. The financial disclosure hearing was scheduled for the second week of December in the Family Division of the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas. Patricia had spent the preceding weeks constructing what she described, with characteristic understatement, as a thorough presentation. I had spent those weeks in the manner that suited me best. Quietly, methodically, and without telling Harold or his attorney what was coming. There is something to be said for the advantage of being underestimated. Harold had spent 2 years assuming I would not look too closely, would not ask the right questions, would not find the right people. That assumption had given me time. I had used every minute of it. George Aldrich's text messages, it turned out, were more than I had allowed myself to hope for. Harold, in the course of confiding in his oldest friend over the previous 18 months, had sent 23 text messages detailing his plans in terms that were, legally speaking, extraordinarily useful. There were references to the Midwest account and its growing balance. There was a message about the timing of the beneficiary change, with Harold explaining that he wanted it done before anything goes public. Most significantly, there was an exchange from 8 months ago in which Harold wrote, plainly, that he had been told by his financial advisor to restructure the portfolio in my name only while everything's still quiet. That last message meant there was a portfolio, a stock portfolio separate from the known accounts, that had been restructured during the marriage without my knowledge or consent. Patricia had suspected it. Now we could prove it. I arrived at the courthouse on a cold December morning with Patricia beside me and Susan in a seat behind the bar. I wore the charcoal coat again. I believe in consistency. I also believe that how you present yourself in a room tells the room something about how seriously you take what's happening in it. I was very serious. Robert Finch presented first, offering what he characterized as a complete disclosure of Harold's assets. The list was, by any measure, substantially more complete than what Harold had been willing to discuss on a terrace in September. The Midwest savings account was acknowledged, disclosed presumably because it had already been identified and there was no longer any point in concealing it. The stock portfolio was present. The pension valuation was included. What was notably absent, and what Patricia had been waiting for, was the full transaction history of the portfolio restructuring. Patricia stood up. She introduced George Aldrich's text messages into evidence with his written consent, properly authenticated. She introduced records obtained through subpoena from the financial advisory firm Harold had used, records showing that in March of the previous year, Harold had transferred a joint investment account, valued at the time at $112,000, into a single-name account. The transfer had been made without my signature, without my knowledge, and, according to the firm's own compliance records, without the required spousal consent documentation for a jointly held marital account. The room was quiet for a moment after Patricia finished. That particular quality of quiet that happens when a document says something that cannot be unsaid. I heard Robert Finch say quietly, something that may have been a profanity. Judge Warren asked Finch to address the discrepancy. Finch requested a brief recess. It was denied. What followed was not dramatic, in the cinematic sense. There was no shouting. There was no tearful confession. What there was, instead, was Harold's composure, which had held, as far as I knew, for 50 years. Quietly and entirely coming undone. He was sitting at the table next to Finch, and I watched him as the evidence was presented. He had aged in the past 3 months. He looked smaller somehow, diminished in the way that men who have constructed a large image of themselves tend to look when that image is reviewed in fluorescent light. The blue sweater from the living room visit was gone. He wore a dark jacket and a tie that didn't quite sit straight. Finch had probably told him to dress conservatively. He had tried. It wasn't enough. He tried once to pass Finch a note. Finch was busy. He tried again. Then he did something I had never seen Harold Ellis do in 50 years of marriage. He put his face in his hands. It was not grief. I want to be clear about that. I knew Harold's grief. I had seen it when his mother died, when our dog died, when Michael's first marriage ended. This was not grief. This was the specific distress of a man who has miscalculated and knows it, who has watched his plan dissolve in real time and cannot locate an exit. There is no dignity in it, but there is a kind of bitter clarity. He had done this. He had constructed every piece of it. And now he was sitting in a courtroom in December with his face in his hands, and a judge looking down at him with the careful neutrality that is, in its own way, the most devastating expression a judge can wear. Finch, to his credit as a professional, recovered quickly. He acknowledged the portfolio transfer, attributed it to an administrative misunderstanding, and offered an amendment to the disclosure on the spot. Judge Warren accepted the amendment and noted, with the particular precision of judges who have seen the same maneuver many times, that any further administrative misunderstandings discovered post-hearing would be treated as deliberate concealment. Patricia requested and received, before we left the courthouse, a preliminary asset protection order covering all identified marital assets, including the restructured portfolio. I thanked Patricia in the parking lot. Susan held my arm on the way to the car. The sky had gone white with the threat of snow, and the city was loud and ordinary around us, and I felt something that I think was the opposite of what I had felt on the terrace in September. Not collapse. Not diminishment. Something like solidity. Like the ground confirming it was still there. I had walked into that courthouse as the woman Harold had tried to leave with nothing. I walked out as the woman who had just watched his plan come apart, document by document, in front of a judge who was not impressed by any of it. The weeks between the disclosure hearing and the final settlement were, in their way, the quietest of the entire ordeal. Harold and Finch knew the territory had shifted. Patricia knew it. And I, sitting in my house on Maple Drive with the asset protection order in place and every financial record finally in the light, knew it most of all. There is a particular kind of peace that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the knowledge that you have done everything within your power and done it well. I had that peace now. Whatever the final numbers, I had not been passive. I had not been frightened into silence. I had shown up at Patricia's office, at the courthouse, at my own front door when they came to wear me down. And I had held the line every time. Finch requested a mediated settlement conference in early January. Patricia agreed. We sat in a neutral conference room. Harold and Finch on one side, Patricia and I on the other. A mediator named Dr. Sandra Cole at the head of the table. The room was beige and corporate, with a water dispenser in the corner and a whiteboard no one used. Harold looked at me once when we entered, and then, for the duration of the 4-hour proceeding, did not look at me again. I didn't need him to. I had said everything I needed to say in rooms like this one. Patricia had prepared a complete accounting of marital contributions. My 26 years of teaching income documented through tax records. My share of every mortgage payment made over 4 decades, extrapolated from salary documentation and bank records going back to 1981. The household labor contribution. Not a number I had ever expected to see in a legal document, but Ohio courts recognize it, and Patricia had calculated it carefully using established standards. The total figure of my documented contribution to marital assets in her accounting came to significantly more than Harold's restructured portfolio was worth on its own. The negotiation was not a negotiation in any genuine sense. It was a recalibration. Robert Finch made an opening offer that Patricia declined in 3 sentences. He made a second. She declined that too. By the third offer, Finch and Harold were conferring in the hallway for 20 minutes. I stayed in the conference room and drank a glass of water and watched the snow beginning to fall outside the window. I was not anxious. I had been anxious for 3 months, and I was through with it. When they came back, they accepted Patricia's framework, the final agreement. I received full title to the Maple Drive house, transferred to my name within 60 days. I received 50% of the combined liquid assets, including the Midwest savings account and the restructured portfolio, approximately $179,000 in total. I received a support payment, indexed to Harold's pension, for the duration of his life or mine, whichever ended first. I received, additionally, full reimbursement of my legal fees, which Patricia had argued as a consequence of Harold's deliberate financial concealment. That last item, she told me later, was the one that had taken the longest to negotiate. Finch had resisted it to the end. Patricia had not moved a single inch. Harold signed the agreement on a Tuesday morning in January. I watched his hand move across the document. The same hand that had held mine at the altar, that had signed our mortgage in 1981, that had reached for Cheryl Patterson's across a candlelit table at Aurelio's. And I felt something that I think was the opposite of triumph, exactly. Triumph is too bright a word for what it was. It was more like the satisfaction of an account finally balanced, of a record that for 50 years had listed 2 names returning the appropriate amounts to each party. I had contributed. I had built. I had a right to what I had built. The document on the table confirmed it in language a court would enforce. I signed my copy. Patricia shook my hand. Outside the window, January continued without ceremony. As for what happened with Cheryl Patterson in the aftermath of the court proceedings, I heard this from Doris, who heard it from their mutual acquaintance at the church social committee, so I cannot vouch entirely for every detail. But the broad shape of it was this. Harold's financial situation, significantly reduced from what he had imagined it would be, did not produce the life he had promised her. The apartment he moved into was in a complex on the edge of town, comfortable enough, but nothing like the retirement he had envisioned. The travel he had hinted at, the ease he had implied was waiting once the marriage was behind him. Cheryl, who had perhaps imagined herself stepping into something prosperous, found instead that she had attached herself to a man whose resources were now halved, whose reputation in the community had taken a visible blow, and whose mood, by all accounts, was not improved by any of it. 2 of her closest friends at the church quietly distanced themselves. The red hair was still impeccably styled, I was told, but the warmth she had cultivated, the hand on the arm, the sympathetic tilt of the head, was harder to deploy in a room that knew the context of how she had come to be so closely associated with a man in the middle of a contentious divorce. Sympathy, it turns out, travels in the direction of whoever the community has decided was wronged. The community had decided. Harold came once to the house in February to collect a remaining box of his belongings. I was in the kitchen. I heard his key in the lock and then remembered, belatedly, that the lock had been changed in December. He knocked. I went to the door. He looked at me for a long moment, standing on the front step of the house that was no longer his. He seemed to want to say something. An explanation, perhaps, or a justification, or possibly something that had once been intended as an apology, but had never quite found the right moment in the preceding months. Whatever it was, he did not manage to locate it. "The box is in the garage," I said. He nodded. He took the box. He left. The door closed behind him, and the house on Maple Drive was mine. Only mine, officially and completely mine. For the first time in 43 years. I stood in the hallway and listened to the silence. And the silence was very good. Spring came to Maple Drive the way it always had. The forsythia along the back fence going yellow overnight, the cardinals reappearing at the feeder, the particular quality of morning light in the kitchen that I have loved since the first March we spent in this house. Except that this spring the house was wholly mine, and the love of it was different. Cleaner, somehow, uncomplicated by the question of what might be taken from me. I walked through every room the first morning of March with my coffee cup in hand, not inspecting, not cataloging, just being present in it. The sage green hallway, the kitchen with its worn floorboards, the back bedroom where the light comes in at an angle in the late afternoon, mine. Simply, entirely, undeniably mine. In March, I repainted the upstairs hallway the soft sage green I had wanted for a decade. Harold had consistently preferred the original beige. Susan came up from Cincinnati for the weekend, and we did it together, badly and happily, with a drop cloth that didn't quite cover the baseboards and music playing from my phone on the windowsill. We laughed more in that one weekend than I could remember laughing in several years. I stood at the top of the stairs on Sunday evening, paint-speckled and tired and genuinely happy, and thought, this is what it feels like to do exactly what you want in your own home. No consultation required, no veto waiting quietly in the next room. In April, I joined a memoir writing group that met on Tuesday mornings at the public library. There were 8 of us, widows and divorcees mostly. One retired pharmacist named Charles, who wrote with great precision about his Korean-American family's immigration story. They welcomed me with the warmth of people who understand that arriving somewhere new after a long time elsewhere takes courage. I had not written seriously since my teaching years. It turned out I had a great deal to say. The first piece I brought to the group was 3 pages about the morning after the anniversary dinner, the dark kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, the arithmetic of loss. When I finished reading, Charles said, "That's the best thing anyone has brought in this year." By June, I had 20 pages of a memoir I was beginning, cautiously, to think might become something real. Daniel and his wife came for Easter with their 2 children, and Michael and his wife came too. There was a moment after dinner when the grandchildren were running through the backyard, and my 2 sons were doing dishes together without being asked. And Susan was sitting beside me on the back steps with a glass of wine. Tyler, my 9-year-old grandson who had stepped on my feet at the anniversary dinner, chased his younger cousin around the forsythia bush until they were both breathless and shrieking with laughter. I watched them and felt something settle in my chest. something that had been displaced for a long time, finding its way back to its proper place. In May, I signed up for a university-affiliated travel program and booked a 2-week trip to the Scottish Highlands and the islands of the Hebrides for September. Harold had always found foreign travel impractical. I paid with my own money, from my own account, and no one needed to be consulted. I ordered a good pair of walking boots and broke them in on long morning walks through the neighborhood, feeling the particular pleasure of a body being prepared for something it is looking forward to. I heard occasional news of Harold through the ordinary channels of a small community. He had moved into an apartment on Ridgeway Drive. He was diminished in the way of a man who has lost the structure he built his days around. Smaller income, a community that had quietly revised its opinion of him, former friends who had stepped back. He attended church still, I was told, in the back row, arriving late and leaving before the coffee hour. A man making himself smaller in a room he used to fill. Cheryl Patterson left town the following autumn. I didn't know whether by choice or necessity, and I found I didn't need to know. Some stories you follow to the end out of justice, and some you let go because your own life has become too interesting to spend time narrating someone else's diminishment. I wished her nothing in particular. That neutrality, I discovered, was its own kind of freedom. I was 79 years old when Harold told me I would walk away with nothing. I was 80 when the settlement was signed, and I owned my home outright, had money in the bank, and had my children's love. I had Tuesday mornings at the library. I had Scotland in September. I had 20 pages of a life being written in my own words, at my own kitchen table. I had, in every sense that counted, everything. 50 years of a life is not nothing, and neither is the woman who lived it. What I learned: trust wisely, document everything, and never mistake someone's certainty about your weakness for an accurate assessment. The moment Harold said you'll get nothing, he showed me exactly what he had underestimated. I didn't fight for victory. I fought for what was already mine. Age is not fragility. Silence is not surrender. And a woman who has spent 50 years building something knows exactly how to protect it. If someone told you, at any age, that you had no power left, what would you do? Leave your answer below, and if this story moved you, please subscribe. There's more to come. Thank you for listening.